Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. The newspaper clipping was brief, almost dismissive in tone. It stated that the man killed outside the town of Red Willow was almost certainly the notorious outlaw Caleb Harlan, long rumored to be dead and just as often rumored to be alive. The article offered no drama, no reflection, just a few lines, a date, and a name that many believed belonged to the past. Caleb Harlan was born on a bitter winter morning in January of 1835 on a small farm in Bryan County, a rugged stretch of land in southern Missouri where families survived by stubbornness more than prosperity. His parents were farmers in the plainest sense. They raised hogs, worked the soil, and trusted little beyond their own hands. Caleb was the third of 6 children, restless from the moment he could walk. His experience with formal schooling lasted exactly 1 day. The teacher attempted discipline. Caleb responded with profanity and defiance. By nightfall, his father made him an offer that would shape the rest of his life. He could return to school and submit to rules, or he could work the farm and learn responsibility through labor. Caleb chose the fields without hesitation. From then on, the threat of school was enough to keep him in line. By 19, Caleb married Eliza Moore, a quiet woman who shared his endurance, if not his temper. Together, they built a modest cabin near his family's land. Like most in the county, the Harlans allowed their hogs to roam freely through the woods. For years, this caused no trouble. Then newcomers arrived, claiming land, fences, and ownership of animals that had wandered across newly drawn boundaries. Arguments became fistfights, fistfights became lawsuits, lawsuits became grudges. The Harlan name began to carry a reputation shaped as much by rumor as by fact. Caleb believed his family was being targeted because they were established, independent, and unwilling to yield to men who arrived late and demanded control. When the Civil War reached the region, old tensions found new excuses to erupt. Bryan County sat in a divided land where loyalty to the Union or the Confederacy could shift from house to house. Bands of men formed so-called vigilance committees, claiming to defend order while settling personal scores under the cover of patriotism. Caleb later claimed that Confederate sympathizers in the area often stole horses and sold them across the southern lines. One evening, a cousin suggested trading horses with him. Caleb agreed, only to discover days later that the horse could barely pull a plow. He traded it again, unaware that the animal had been stolen before it ever reached him. That ignorance offered no protection. When the theft was discovered, the Vigilance Committee declared Caleb and his brother Aaron horse thieves and Southern collaborators. In truth, the accusation gave them a reason to pursue a family they already despised. Threats followed. Then promises of violence. Caleb and Aaron fled into the woods, living off what little they could carry. One cold night, driven by hunger and concern for his family, Caleb returned home. He walked straight into an ambush. Gunfire shattered the darkness. He escaped only by throwing himself into the brush, bullets tearing through the branches behind him. Days later, he returned again, this time to move Eliza and their children. But the situation worsened. Aaron attempted to join a Union militia unit, hoping allegiance would protect him. Instead, he was recognized, seized by the Vigilance Committee, and hanged without trial. Caleb learned of his brother's death while hiding miles away. Something hardened in him that night. Grief did not soften into mourning, it sharpened into resolve. The committees were no longer content to intimidate. They claimed authority to remove anyone suspected of Confederate sympathy. With a detachment of Union soldiers, they attacked Caleb's new cabin. He escaped, but not before a bullet shattered his leg. The house was burned to the ground. Eliza and the children were left standing in the cold with nothing but the clothes they wore. Caleb lay in a ditch for hours, blood soaking into the frozen earth. He later said that as he drifted in and out of consciousness, he swore he would never forgive the men who had done this. Not them, not the system that empowered them. He fled south into Arkansas, crossing territory filled with deserters, smugglers, and fighters who operated outside any official command. There he encountered Colonel Nathaniel Graves, a Confederate officer known for organizing irregular units. These fighters, known as bushwhackers, lived between law and chaos. They harassed Union patrols, stole supplies, and punished civilians accused of cooperation. To the Union, they were criminals. To themselves, they were soldiers without uniforms. Caleb returned to Bryan County with a singular purpose. One by one, he hunted the men who had hanged his brother and destroyed his home. He waited, watched, and struck when they were alone. Some were shot on roads, others were killed in their fields. He made no effort to hide what he was doing. Retaliation came swiftly. The remaining vigilantes and Union supporters drove Caleb's mother from her home and burned it to the ground. His uncle was murdered. 2 more brothers were killed under suspicious circumstances. Each death fed the cycle, binding Caleb more tightly to violence. While continuing his personal vendetta, Caleb also led raids across the region. His men ambushed supply wagons, attacked patrols, and robbed known Union sympathizers. He became a ghost people whispered about, a man who seemed to appear and vanish at will. It was said he carried a rifle he named Black Mercy, carving a mark into the stock for every man he killed. Estimates varied wildly. Some claimed 50, others said closer to 100. Caleb never corrected them. When the war ended, he felt cheated. Peace arrived before he believed justice had been done. In his own words, he later wrote that the war ended while his enemies still breathed. He wanted to continue fighting, but exhaustion and Eliza's pleading wore him down. In May of 1865, he accepted a parole. He rented land in Arkansas and tried to return to farming. For a time, it almost worked. The soil did not argue, crops did not betray him, but memory followed him like a shadow. In 1869, he moved his family back near Bryan County, settling just across the border in neighboring Clay Ridge County. The men who had survived his wrath took notice. Fear stirred old alliances. Letters were written. Officials were contacted. Soon, a bounty was placed on Caleb Harlan's head. Newspapers as far away as New York printed his name alongside the reward. $10,000 was promised to whoever could bring him in, dead or alive. Hunters came. Some were professionals. Others were desperate men chasing money they believed would change their lives. An assassination attempt left Caleb wounded but alive. Surrounded at a relative's house, he fought his way out, disappearing into the countryside. The governor called in the militia. The hunt spread across state lines. Caleb fled south with his children, drifting from place to place. In 1870, he dictated his life story to 2 traveling journalists, determined to shape the narrative before someone else did. He framed his actions not as crimes, but as necessary retaliation. Eliza died some time after, worn down by years of fear and movement. Caleb never spoke much about her death. Eventually, he settled in Red Willow, Illinois, under a quiet name, earning his living cutting wood. For a while, the world seemed to forget him, until it didn't. Life in Red Willow settled into a rhythm that Caleb Harlan had not known since boyhood. The town was small, tucked between fields and timberland, the kind of place where men were measured by how steadily they worked and how little trouble followed them home. Caleb cut wood from dawn until his hands numbed, hauled it into town, and sold it for enough to feed his children. He spoke little, kept his eyes lowered, and avoided saloons. To most, he was just another worn-down laborer with a limp and a past he did not discuss. But pasts like Caleb's do not stay buried. They wait. Rumors drifted in from Missouri and Arkansas, carried by traders and travelers who spoke of a man long hunted and never caught. Some said the outlaw had been killed years earlier. Others claimed he had crossed into Mexico. A few insisted he lived quietly somewhere north, hiding in plain sight. Caleb heard these stories and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He knew how myths worked. They kept men alive long after their bodies failed, and they invited danger from those who wanted to test the legend. The bounty still existed, even if it had faded from the headlines. Not all rewards needed fresh ink to motivate hungry men. Caleb's children grew older and began to ask questions. They had been too young during the war to understand why they were always moving, why nights were spent in silence, why strangers made their father tense. Caleb gave them simple answers. He told them some people held grudges longer than others. He did not explain that entire counties had once sworn to see him dead. One evening, trouble came quietly. A town constable stopped Caleb on the street and informed him that a complaint had been made. The charge was minor, a violation of a local ordinance involving disorderly conduct. Caleb followed the officer without protest. He had learned long ago that resistance often turns small matters into deadly ones. The trial was brief. A fine was issued. It should have ended there. But as Caleb was being led away, another officer stepped forward and claimed there was an outstanding accusation against him, assault with intent to kill, tied to an incident that had occurred months earlier in another town. Caleb denied it. The denial did not matter. As they moved to restrain him further, panic surged. It was not fear of jail that drove him, but memory. He saw his brother swinging from a rope. He saw his house burning. He felt again the helplessness of being surrounded by men who believed themselves righteous. Caleb resisted. The struggle was sudden and chaotic. In the confusion, he drew a knife. The blade flashed once, striking a deputy in the leg. Blood spilled onto the dirt. Another officer fired. The shot struck Caleb in the head, dropping him where he stood. By the time the dust settled, the man many believed dead for years lay motionless on the ground. News traveled quickly. The sheriff sent word to surrounding towns. Within hours, people arrived to see for themselves. Some recognized him immediately. Others needed confirmation. Caleb's surviving brother Thomas was summoned. He took one look at the body and nodded. There was no doubt. The desperado who had haunted the region for a decade was finally gone. The deputy Caleb had stabbed survived, though the injury left him with a limp that followed him for the rest of his life. He would later move west, carrying with him the story of the day he nearly died at the hands of a man already a legend. As for the bounty, it did not deliver the fortune many expected. Legal disputes, expired claims, and bureaucratic hesitation reduced the reward to a fraction of its promised value. The officers involved received some money, not enough to change their lives, just enough to remind others that chasing ghosts rarely paid as advertised. Caleb Harlan was buried without ceremony. There was no marker to speak of, no inscription to explain who lay beneath the soil. His children were taken in by relatives, scattered once more across different towns and states. His story, however, refused to fade. Newspapers argued over who he really was. Some painted him as a ruthless killer who used war as an excuse for murder. Others portrayed him as a man shaped and broken by injustice, driven to violence by forces beyond his control. Each side found evidence to support its claims, and neither could fully erase the other. In the years that followed, travelers passing through Bryan County still heard whispers. Old men spoke of vigilance committees that acted more like mobs. Women remembered homes burned and families ruined without trial. Others recalled neighbors killed by a man who never forgot a slight and never forgave a wrong. Caleb's own words surfaced again through the autobiography he had dictated years earlier. In it, he made no plea for mercy. He did not ask the reader to sympathize. He stated plainly that he sought revenge and found it, that he believed justice had failed him first, and that everything that followed was consequence. Some readers took comfort in that certainty, others recoiled from it. Historians would later struggle to categorize him. He did not fit neatly into the roles of soldier or outlaw, hero or villain. He existed in the blurred space between, shaped by a war that turned neighbors into enemies and laws into weapons. What remained undeniable was the trail he left behind: burned homes, graves without names, children raised on the move, communities that learned how thin the line between order and chaos could be. Red Willow returned to its quiet routines after his death. The saloon reopened, the streets filled again, but for those who witnessed the final moments, something lingered, a sense that the violence had not so much ended as concluded a chapter. Caleb Harlan had lived by a single rule after his brother's death. He believed that wrongs demanded payment, and that forgiveness was a luxury reserved for those who had lost everything. That belief carried him across states, through war, and into legend. Whether his actions justified it was a question left to others. Caleb himself had already answered it in blood and fire. In the end, the man who once commanded fear died not on a battlefield or in a dramatic standoff, but in a small town over a minor charge, in a moment where instinct overpowered restraint. It was an ending that felt almost ironic, considering the scale of the life that preceded it. Yet perhaps it was fitting, a reminder that even the most feared figures are undone not by destiny, but by ordinary moments that spiral out of control. And so the story passed into memory, retold in fragments, reshaped by time. Some said Caleb Harlan was a monster. Others said he was a product of his era. Most agreed on one thing: the war did not end when the cannons fell silent. For men like Caleb, it followed them home. The years after Caleb Harlan's death did not bring the clean sense of closure many expected. Instead, they left behind a long echo. It truly was, long after his body was lowered into an unmarked grave and the dust settled over the place where he fell. In towns along the borderlands, his name became a kind of shorthand. To some, another Harlan meant a man who refused to bow, who answered cruelty with cruelty and paid for it with his life. To others, it was a warning, a reminder of what happened when vengeance replaced restraint and when personal justice became indistinguishable from murder. Parents used his story to frighten children away from violence. Old soldiers used it to explain why the war had never really ended for them. Caleb's children grew up carrying the weight of his name, even when they tried to leave it behind. Some changed their surnames. Others moved west, hoping distance would do what time had not. They were asked questions they could not answer. Did he regret what he did? Was he proud of it? Did he love his family more than his hatred? Those were questions only Caleb could have answered, and he had taken his answers with him. Occasionally, one of the children would speak of him softly, not as the outlaw or the killer, but as a father who worked until his hands bled, who taught them how to read the weather and cut wood straight, who checked the locks twice each night and listened for footsteps in the dark. That version of Caleb rarely made it into print, but it existed all the same. Historians eventually pieced together the broader picture. They documented how vigilante committees formed under the banner of law but acted with personal motives, how accusations became death sentences without trials, how families were punished not for crimes proven but for loyalties assumed. In that light, Caleb's transformation from farmer to guerrilla to fugitive seemed less like a sudden fall and more like a slow narrowing of options. Yet the numbers remained. Dozens of men dead by his hand, raids that left widows and orphans in their wake, fear that spread across counties whenever word surfaced that he had been seen nearby. Context explained some things, but it did not erase the blood. Churches debated his soul. Some ministers argued that repentance was possible even at the last moment, that no man was beyond redemption. Others pointed to his own words, his refusal to apologize, his belief that revenge had been righteous. They asked whether salvation could exist without remorse. The sermons drew crowds, not because people expected answers, but because the question itself unsettled them. The deputy who shot Caleb carried his own burden. Though many praised him for ending a long manhunt, he rarely spoke of the incident. Those who knew him said he replayed it often, wondering if a different choice, a slower moment, might have led to an arrest instead of a death. His limp was a constant reminder that legends were made of flesh and bone, and that confronting them came at a cost. Over time, official records simplified the story. Reports reduced Caleb to dates, locations, and charges. The complexity of his life flattened into a sequence of crimes followed by a fatal encounter. That version was easier to archive, easier to teach, easier to forget. But among the people who lived through the era, the story remained messy and unresolved. Some nights, older residents of Bryer County still told stories by lamplight. They spoke of burned houses glowing against the dark, of gunfire echoing through timberland, of a man who moved like a shadow and struck without warning. Others spoke of the committees, the lists of names, the certainty with which neighbors turned on neighbors. The stories contradicted each other, overlapped and tangled, but they all shared one truth. Once violence took root, it spread quickly and without mercy. Caleb's autobiography continued to circulate, passed hand to hand, reprinted in fragments, quoted out of context. Readers argued over his words, over whether they revealed honesty or delusion. He wrote with clarity, even pride, describing his revenge as a duty fulfilled. Some admired the bluntness, others recoiled from the absence of doubt. Psychologists who later studied such figures pointed to trauma, prolonged exposure to violence, and the erosion of moral boundaries during war. They noted how repeated loss could harden a person until empathy gave way to fixation. Caleb fit many of those patterns, though he lived before such language existed. He had no framework to process what he endured, only the belief that force was the only answer left to him. In that sense, his story became less about one man and more about a system that failed repeatedly, a system that allowed mobs to masquerade as justice, a system that rewarded brutality and called it order. Caleb was both a product of that system and one of its most extreme outcomes. Years later, a small article appeared in a regional paper questioning the size of the bounty placed on his head. Records showed inflated figures, political posturing, and promises never fully honored. Men had hunted him believing a fortune awaited, only to receive scraps. The revelation fueled bitterness, but also underscored a larger truth. Caleb's life and death had been used by others for leverage, fear, and spectacle. As time passed, fewer people remembered the details. Names blurred, locations shifted. The core of the story, however, endured. A man wronged, a war that stripped away restraint, revenge pursued without limit, an ending that came not with triumph, but exhaustion. Caleb Harlan did not live to see the world change, to see laws strengthened and vigilante justice slowly condemned. He did not live to reconcile with the fact that his war had outlasted its original cause. Whether he would have chosen differently with that knowledge remains unknowable. What remains is the caution embedded in his story, that injustice, once unleashed, rarely confines itself to its original targets, that violence justified once becomes easier to justify again, that men shaped by chaos often carry it with them long after the battlefields fall silent. In the end, Caleb Harlan became exactly what he feared most, a figure defined by loss and bloodshed, remembered not for the life he tried to reclaim, but for the destruction he left behind. His name faded from wanted posters and court documents, but lingered in memory as a reminder of how quickly a man can be transformed when revenge becomes purpose. And so his story closes not with absolution or condemnation, but with an uneasy understanding. Caleb was neither purely monster nor misunderstood hero. He was a man forged in cruelty, sharpened by grief, and broken by a world that taught him survival meant striking first. The war ended on paper. For Caleb Harlan, it never truly did. February 2011 arrived heavy and gray in the coastal city of Northport, a place where winter had a way of pressing down on people until even simple routines felt like work. Snowbanks lined the streets, daylight came and went too quickly, and everyone seemed to move with their shoulders slightly hunched, bracing against cold winds that cut straight through thick coats. It was the kind of month where people held tightly to habits, morning coffee stops, familiar faces, predictable schedules. That was why the disappearance of Emily Larson struck such a nerve. Emily was 22, a barista at a small roadside espresso stand just off the main highway. She worked evening shifts, serving commuters and night owls, joking with regulars, humming softly while she wiped down counters. She had lived in Northport her entire life. People knew her, not in a celebrity way, but in the quiet, local sense. She was someone you nodded to in passing, someone who remembered your order, someone who felt like part of the background rhythm of the city. On the night of February 1st, Emily finished her shift as usual. She locked up the stand shortly after closing time. Surveillance cameras showed nothing unusual. No struggle, no sign of distress. She simply stepped out into the cold night and vanished. When she did not return home, her father noticed immediately. Mark Larson had raised Emily on his own since she was a child. Their routines were deeply intertwined. Even on nights when she worked late, she would text him a simple "home soon" or "don't wait up." That night, there was nothing. By morning, worry had taken root. Calls went unanswered. Her phone rang, but no one picked up. By the afternoon, panic replaced hope. Mark contacted police. Friends were called. Emily's boyfriend, Ryan, retraced her usual routes, driving slowly past the coffee stand, the gas station down the road, the turnoff she normally used to head home. There was no sign of her car, no sign of Emily. Then the messages started. Late that evening, Ryan's phone buzzed. A text from Emily's number. "I'm going to stay with a friend for a few days. Please don't worry." It should have brought relief. Instead, it made his stomach drop. Ryan stared at the screen, reading the message over and over. Emily never spoke like that. She never disappeared without explanation. She never left town without telling him who she was with. And she certainly would not have gone anywhere without her phone charger, her makeup bag, her clothes. All of those things were still at her apartment. Another message came shortly after. "Tell my dad I love him. I'll come home soon." Ryan felt cold all over. He showed the messages to Mark, hoping desperately that the words would calm him. Instead, they had the opposite effect. Mark knew his daughter's voice. He knew how she wrote. These messages felt stiff, unnatural, like someone imitating her but missing something essential. Police were notified immediately. Detectives took the messages seriously but urged caution. Adults were allowed to leave voluntarily. There was no direct evidence of a crime. Still, something felt wrong. Days passed with no further communication. Emily's face began appearing on flyers taped to store windows, telephone poles, and bus stops. Her bright smile stared back from grainy photos, paired with bold lettering asking if anyone had seen her. Volunteers organized search efforts along nearby trails and wooded areas. Local radio stations interrupted programming to describe her disappearance. Mark offered a reward, $12,500. It was everything he could manage. Those who knew him were certain he would have offered more if he had it. He barely slept. He lost weight. Friends worried about his health, but he refused to slow down. Searching for Emily became the only thing that mattered. On February 11th, over 1,000 people gathered at Harbor Square, candles glowing against the snow. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, silent except for the sound of wind and soft crying. Mark spoke briefly, his voice shaking as he thanked the crowd. He asked only one thing: bring his daughter home. While Northport mourned and hoped, another man watched from a distance. His name was Daniel Cross. Daniel lived quietly on the outskirts of the city, in a modest house with a detached shed behind it. To neighbors, he was forgettable, polite enough, kept to himself. He had a young daughter who visited on school days and a girlfriend who worked long shifts. He blended in easily, which had always been his intention. At the time of Emily's disappearance, Daniel was far from Northport. He was stepping off a cruise ship in Port Vallon, Louisiana, stretching beneath warm skies, savoring the feeling of being untethered. He had followed the news from afar. He knew about the posters, the vigils, the reward. He read every update with detached amusement. He knew exactly where Emily was, and that knowledge gave him a quiet thrill. While families prayed and volunteers searched frozen ground, Daniel wandered markets and waterfronts, unbothered by guilt or urgency. He felt no pressure to act. Time, to him, was a luxury. Watching the city scramble without answers was part of the satisfaction. On his return journey, Daniel passed through Redfield, Texas. Restless again, he drifted into trouble. A large, unoccupied property caught his attention. What happened there later made local headlines: an unexplained fire, structures lost, no injuries. Witnesses described a man who seemed eerily calm as flames rose into the night sky. Daniel asked for directions and left before authorities arrived. By February 19th, he was back in Northport. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. His daughter returned to school. His girlfriend left early for work. Daniel relished the quiet hours alone. He unlocked the shed behind his house, the one he rarely allowed anyone to enter. Inside, he confronted the reality he had been avoiding: Emily. What followed over the next 2 days was calculated and deliberate. Daniel believed himself careful, intelligent. He believed he could control the narrative just as easily as he had controlled Emily. He gathered supplies, planned messages, studied the news coverage closely, adjusting his ideas based on public reaction. He sent another message from Emily's number, this time with instructions: a park, a photograph, a typed note demanding money far beyond the original reward. He found the entire situation deeply entertaining. Police took the message seriously. Surveillance teams were deployed, but something was off. The details didn't align. The tone was wrong. Investigators began to suspect they were no longer dealing with a missing person case, but something darker. Daniel, however, believed himself untouchable. By the time he set his final plan into motion, he felt satisfied. The city had danced to his tune long enough. It was time to disappear back into his ordinary life, convinced he had outsmarted everyone. What Daniel did not understand is that control is fragile. One mistake, one overlooked detail, one loose thread can unravel even the most carefully constructed illusion. And Northport was already closer to the truth than he realized. The message sent from Emily's phone changed everything. Up until that point, police had been forced to treat the case cautiously. Adults disappeared for many reasons, but the ransom demand shifted the investigation into an entirely different category. Now there was intent. Now there was manipulation. And most importantly, now there was a clock. The note directed Ryan to a small park on the edge of Northport, a place rarely used in winter. Detectives instructed him not to go alone. Plainclothes officers arrived first, scanning the area before allowing Ryan to retrieve what had been left behind. Tucked beneath a park bench was an envelope weighted with a stone. Inside was a typed letter and a photograph. The photograph showed Emily sitting upright, eyes closed, her face pale beneath heavy makeup. At first glance, it looked like proof of life, but something about it unsettled the investigators immediately. Her posture was stiff, her skin tone uneven. The date printed on the newspaper beside her was recent, but the details didn't align. The longer detectives studied the image, the more uncomfortable they became. The letter demanded $30,000 to be transferred directly into Emily's bank account. No instructions for pickup, no clear timeline, just a threat that if the demand was not met, Emily would never come home. Mark Larson was brought in to view the materials. He stared at the photograph in silence for a long time before quietly shaking his head. "That's not her," he said. "She wouldn't sit like that. She wouldn't look like that." Investigators agreed. Something was wrong. Digital forensics teams began dissecting the messages. While they were sent from Emily's phone, subtle inconsistencies appeared. Timing gaps, location data that didn't match movement patterns. The phone had not traveled the way a living person would. It stayed still for long stretches, then suddenly appeared in public places only long enough to send messages. Someone was staging the communication. As police tightened their focus, Daniel Cross grew restless. He followed news coverage obsessively now, less amused than before. The tone had shifted. Reporters spoke of foul play openly. Police no longer used cautious language. Daniel sensed a tension closing in, though he could not identify exactly how. Still, he convinced himself he was ahead of them. He had always been ahead of people. He disposed of items he no longer needed, burned what could be burned, cleaned spaces meticulously. He told his girlfriend little, other than to remind her not to enter the shed. She had learned long ago not to ask questions. On February 21st, Daniel drove north toward Glasswater Lake, a remote area where ice still covered the surface. It was a place he had fished many times, familiar, quiet. He believed it was perfect. Later that same day, police received another break. A fire investigation in Redfield, Texas, resurfaced in national databases. A witness description matched a man who bore resemblance to Daniel Cross. Travel records placed Daniel on a route consistent with that timeline. The connection was thin, but it was enough to justify a closer look. Detectives ran Daniel's name. What they found was not extensive, but it was troubling. A history of minor offenses, property disputes, reports of erratic behavior that never quite rose to the level of arrest. More importantly, they found his connection to Emily. She had served him coffee. He was a regular. That alone did not mean guilt, but it meant opportunity. Surveillance was authorized. Officers quietly observed Daniel's home. They noted the shed, the long hours he spent alone, the way he seemed unconcerned with the ongoing search, despite living in the same city as the missing woman. Then came the financial anomaly. Emily's bank account showed no activity consistent with the ransom demand, no deposits, no attempts to move money. It made no sense for a kidnapper motivated by profit, which suggested something else entirely: control, attention, enjoyment. Police obtained a warrant for Daniel's phone records. Deleted messages surfaced. Location data revealed inconsistencies with his stated travel history. Most damning of all, traces of Emily's phone usage appeared on Daniel's home network. The illusion began to crack. On February 24th, detectives approached Daniel under the guise of a routine interview. He welcomed them in calmly, too calmly. He answered questions politely, offering rehearsed explanations. He admitted knowing Emily casually from the coffee stand, nothing more. When asked about his recent travel, he hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Officers requested consent to search the property. Daniel refused. That refusal was all they needed. A warrant was issued the following morning. When officers entered the shed, the temperature inside was unnaturally cold. The space was organized almost obsessively so, but beneath that order was evidence that could not be explained away. Traces, materials, the unmistakable signs of concealment. Daniel was taken into custody without resistance. During questioning, his demeanor shifted. The charm fell away. He grew distant, detached. When confronted with evidence, he did not deny it outright. Instead, he spoke in abstract terms about boredom, about curiosity, about how people were so predictable when afraid. He described watching the vigil on television while sipping a drink hundreds of miles away. He described reading Mark's statements online with fascination rather than guilt. At no point did he express remorse. Search teams were dispatched to Glasswater Lake. After days of cutting through ice and methodical scanning, they found what they had feared. The case transitioned from missing person to homicide. Northport reeled. The city that had come together in hope now gathered in grief. The candlelight vigils returned, heavier this time. Mark Larson spoke again, his voice steadier but hollow. He thanked police. He thanked strangers. He said goodbye. Daniel Cross was charged with multiple offenses, including murder, arson, and obstruction. Media outlets descended on the city. Questions poured in. How could someone live among them and commit such an act? How could no one have known? The answer, as always, was uncomfortable, because monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like neighbors, customers, strangers passing by unnoticed. And as Northport braced for the trial to come, one truth settled deeply into the collective consciousness. Evil did not arrive screaming. It arrived quietly, smiling, ordering coffee, and waiting patiently for the right moment to act. The city would never forget that lesson. The trial began the following winter, nearly a year after Emily vanished. By then, Northport had learned how to live with the weight of what had happened, though the weight never truly lifted. The coffee stand where Emily once worked had closed. Someone had left flowers there for months until the snow buried them. People still lowered their voices when they spoke her name. Daniel Cross entered the courtroom each morning without expression. He wore clean, pressed clothes and kept his eyes forward. To anyone who did not know the case, he could have passed for an accountant or a school administrator. That contrast unsettled everyone in the room. The prosecution laid out the story slowly, carefully, piece by piece. They did not rush. They wanted the jury to understand not just what Daniel had done, but how methodically it unfolded. They showed how he observed Emily over time, how he learned her routines, how he waited for the right moment. They explained the text messages, the staged photograph, the ransom demand that was never meant to succeed. This was not a crime of desperation or panic. It was a crime built on control. Digital experts testified about the phone records. They showed how Emily's phone had been powered on and off in ways that made no sense for a living person. They traced signals back to Daniel's property. Fire investigators testified about the arson in Texas, explaining how it aligned with Daniel's travel history. Each witness added another layer until the picture became impossible to ignore. Mark Larson sat through every day of testimony. Some days he stared straight ahead, other days he closed his eyes. When he took the stand, his voice barely wavered. He spoke about Emily's plans, her excitement about school, the way she texted him constantly about small, meaningless things. He told the jury that the last messages from her did not sound like her. He said he knew something was wrong the moment he read them. The defense attempted to frame Daniel as mentally unstable, overwhelmed, detached from reality. They suggested substance abuse. They hinted at psychological breaks. But even their own experts struggled to explain the level of planning involved. Whatever Daniel was, he was not confused. When Daniel chose to speak, the courtroom held its breath. He did not apologize. Instead, he talked about emptiness, about how life felt dull and repetitive, about how people reacted so predictably to fear. He spoke as if he were describing an experiment rather than a human life. The judge stopped him more than once, instructing him to answer questions directly. Daniel seemed irritated by the interruption. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, no one was surprised. Guilty on all counts. Daniel was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, he glanced briefly toward the gallery. His expression never changed. For many, the verdict brought relief. For others, it brought nothing at all. There was no sentence that could restore what had been taken. Justice in cases like this always felt incomplete. In the months that followed, investigations turned inward. The city commissioned reviews. Could anything have been done differently? Were there signs that had been missed? The uncomfortable answer was that there were signs, but none that clearly pointed to disaster. Daniel had lived just close enough to normal to avoid suspicion. That realization troubled people more than anything else. Emily's father sold his home and moved closer to family. Before he left, he established a foundation in her name, focused on victim advocacy and community awareness. He spoke at schools and public forums, not with anger, but with quiet resolve. He reminded people to trust their instincts, to ask questions, to look twice. The case faded from national headlines, as these stories always do, but in Northport it never fully disappeared. It lingered in the way people locked their doors earlier, in the way parents waited outside after shifts ended, in the way the community learned that safety was not guaranteed by familiarity. Years later, a reporter would ask a detective who worked the case what haunted him the most. He did not mention the evidence or the crime scene. He said it was the photograph, not because it was convincing, but because someone had believed it could be, because someone thought they could manipulate hope and grief so easily, because it proved how fragile trust really is. Daniel Cross now lives out his days in a concrete cell, largely forgotten by the world he once terrorized. He no longer has an audience, no longer has control. The boredom he feared has found him at last. Emily's name, however, is still spoken. It is spoken at memorials, in classrooms, at the foundation that bears her name. She is remembered not for how she died, but for how deeply she was loved and how fiercely people searched for her. And in that way, the final chapter of the story does not belong to the man who tried to erase her. It belongs to the people who refused to let him.